And now I'm super excited to introduce Shubha from Achieve. She's going to present on how a financial mindset is integral to success regardless of geography for nonprofit or profit status and level of scale. Having this economic and financial mindset is super crucial to maximizing the chances of success from day one, especially for impact-oriented endeavors. Shubha is the founder and chief financial storyteller at Achieve, helping first-time technical founders, like all of you, build credible financial stories to raise capital and build successful startups. She's an experienced financial service executive with over 20 years of experience across consulting, insurance, and banking, with experience at McKinsey, Allstate, HSBC Finance, and many others. Experience includes managing credit strategy for $100 billion plus of subprime mortgage portfolio in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis. And she's also the host of the Invisible Inc. podcast with over 75 episodes released, where she's dedicated to equipping first-time founders with finance and related capabilities for scalable venture building. So thank you so much, Shubha, for joining us and sharing your wisdom with our Stanford Healthcare Design Challenge participants. I'll let you take it away. And yeah, thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you. And welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. I know many of you are at very odd time zones, so I appreciate your enthusiasm and energy. And to the extent that, excuse me, your situation allows, I'd love for you to be on video because it's easy for me to understand if I'm getting across or not. And as always, we have a lot to get through. I'm trying to get as much as possible to give you a framework to think on your own, as opposed to kind of teaching you anything. That's not really my goal, but to really instill the financial plug-in in your brain, so to speak, so that you have a strong tool kit for you to proceed regardless of what your eventual venture goals are. So feel free to raise your hand and reach out. If I miss anyone, please feel free to interrupt me. So with that said, let's jump right in. I should be able to hopefully share my screen. Yes, I am able to share my screen. So can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome, fabulous. So financial storytelling, let me present. Here we go. So you should still be able to see my screen, I hope. Yes? Yes, no? Is it still visible?
Yes, I
Okay,
can see
perfect.
it.
Thanks. Okay, so financial storytelling. So just a quick disclaimer, this is not legal or financial advice. I'm required to tell you that. This is just being presented for informational purposes. So please consult a licensed provider for legal or financial advice regarding your personal situation or your startup. So that said, let's talk about why we should care about financial storytelling, right? You guys want to change the world. I'm super inspired by many of your missions. It's all about healthcare. It's all about access, equity. So kudos to you, first of all. And while you're doing all of this stuff, it might feel like finance is the boring stuff and it's like Excel spreadsheets and it's models, and you really have more important things to do, right? Than messing with all of that stuff. I'm here to tell you why that can hurt you and why it's actually much more fun to include it day one, and what's a much better way to think about financial storytelling and financial issues than just boring old spreadsheets. I hate spreadsheets, by the way. So I think there's a lot more fun here. So what we want to cover today is why this is important, how to build your financial story from day one, and therefore avoid wasting time at the end and kind of regroup. Typically what happens is people use it as an afterthought, and it's kind of like you build a car and you never test the engine until it rolls off the lot, and you turn on the ignition and nothing happens. We don't want that to happen to your startup, regardless of whether you're for profit, venture scale, whatever the case might be, right? We want you to build for success from day one. And regardless of your tax status and your growth aspirations, you're going to need money. So having a financial story in place puts you in the best possible position to get that right source of funding for the right kind of venture that you're building, no matter where you are or what kind of venture you're building. So that's what we want to cover today. And again, feel free to stop me anytime. So typically what happens is there's an 800-pound gorilla in the room, as we like to say in the United States, right? Every time you're building a new venture, there's a lot of attention given to the problem, the science and the traction and the team and the technology and all of those things. Are they important? Absolutely. You cannot run without those things. But the thing that's kind of swept under the carpet, either consciously or unconsciously, is this: it all doesn't make sense unless it's held together with a financial story that makes sense, right? So that's the thing that's holding together. Otherwise, it's like throwing in four wheels, a steering wheel here, four passenger seats, they all work and are needed by themselves, but they're not going to run if they're not held together on a chassis of the car, right? That's why this is really critical, and it's important for you not only for getting funded, but also to ensure that your venture actually works economically. So from a healthcare perspective, and by the way, my background is I also teach at other accelerators. I've obviously done the Stanford Healthcare Design Challenge. I think it's the second, third year. I don't remember. I have taught at University of Chicago's deep tech accelerators, multiple other predominantly excuse me, science-focused accelerators, so American Cancer Society, all of those things. So VentureWell, so those are some of the things. And one of the things I notice is when you're talking about healthcare startups, right? There are some things. First of all, startups are risky, but there's some things that are unique to healthcare-focused startups. So first of all, it's typically high risk, right? Because there are so many players in the game, and each of those gates you have to pass through for this to succeed. If one of them doesn't pass through, then it's more challenging. Versus, let's say, trying to sell widgets on Amazon, right? That's a much less risky endeavor than what you guys are embarking on. So it's high risk, it's multiple uncertainties. What that means is that for anybody to give you money and to be able to support you financially, you need to demonstrate that there's something in it for them, that there's a near certain demand, right? That there's a very high chance that it will succeed. And therefore, you need to demonstrate that you have acknowledged, identified, and mitigated all of those risks. So that's really critical. And that this is a big enough market to justify all of that pain that you have to go through to implement a new solution, right? The second thing is typically you guys are typically technically focused, right? There's a focus on depth versus breadth. Want to go deep into something, especially, if you're more into the medical devices. I don't know how many of you are into medical devices versus just digital health or similar, but there's a technical focus and a preference for depth because you guys are all, I'm assuming you're all very STEM focused, you're all, experts in your own fields. And the temptation is to lean into that, right? And say, let me just retreat to the science. And I know the science, I know the product, and let me not mess with all this other stuff. That's not going to serve you well, right? You have to get into this uncomfortable zone of switching between your scientific and technical lens and a commercial lens for you to be credible, right? To anybody that needs to give you resources, whether that's funding or anything else. And you need to be able to code switch between those two. That's hard to do, but the sooner that you start practicing that, even in small steps, the better served you're going to be, not only to talk to people where you need resources from them, but even to test for yourself, is this thing going to work? And typically, many science-focused startups have high capital needs, and there's a very long time horizon for this to actually pan out and prove its full potential, right? What this means for you guys as the founders and the CEOs is that you need to be very capital conscious and say, every dollar that I put in or every rupee that I put in, what is it going to give me in terms of returns, right? And to have that so that for the least amount of money put in and the resources put in, you're going to stretch the startup's results as far as possible. And you're also able to demonstrate to whoever it is, whether it's a grant writer or a venture capitalist or whoever the case might be, that you're a good steward of money. So that's why it's so super critical for you to understand that having a strong financial story is actually your shortest path to both funding and scale, right? And these are the things you want to be keeping in mind. So if you take nothing else, please remember these 3 principles from financial storytelling. Translate everything in terms of the science and the market into a commercial opportunity. What is the commercial implication? What is a commercial opportunity? The second big thing I want you to remember is, what are the risks? Anybody who's giving you money, regardless of whether a grant writer or investor, they're thinking about what are the risks and what are the rewards. And is that equation something that I'm comfortable with and that is attractive to me? And third, always think about what are the financial outcomes. Therefore, in light of these risks and in terms of this opportunity, how is this path that I'm selling to you, the provider of resources, a credible path to getting good financial outcomes, right? If you take nothing else away from that, keep those things in mind as you move forward building your venture. Make sense so far? Awesome. So let's just go over what a financial story is. I'm going to give you a framework with a few key pillars and then a few critical questions to ask yourself in putting yourself in the place of a very skeptical investor or somebody who's going to give you something, right? Any kind of resources that has value. And put yourself in their shoes. And as you go through this process of asking yourself that question, you'll be much better positioned to answer those credibly and also to build a more viable startup as you go along. So what is a financial story really, right? It's really 3 lenses that need to all speak the same language and point to the same believable story, right? The first is you're here because you see an opportunity. There's something wrong with the world, or there's some new invention that you want to commercialize or bring to the market. So there's an opportunity. Why does this matter, right? What big problem are you trying to solve, and for whom? Is it a big enough, pool of people that are going to be impacted? Doesn't necessarily mean money, but is there big impact big enough for it to matter, for you to, put in all this effort? And why are you any different, right? If there are 10 competing solutions, why is yours better so that it deserves the money and the resources that you're asking for versus, the 5 other solutions that are trying to do the same thing? And how will it pay for itself? The pay for itself doesn't have to be, it differs based on where you're getting money. So if you go to a venture investor, it needs to pay for itself 100 times over, versus maybe if it's a nonprofit, it needs to pay for itself 1 time over, meaning you don't lose money, but it still needs to pay for itself. And you need to be able to explain why and how you will make this happen. So that's the opportunity lens. So once you understand, that's the core of everything, right? That's why you're here. That's why you're excited. That's why you're working so hard. Okay, once you have that happen, next step is going to be where the rubber hits the road. What does that mean in terms of actual facts and numbers, right? So how does this translate into monetary terms? What are the, there are things that you put in, inputs that you put in and outputs that come out, right? So you put in people, you put in money, you put in your science, whatever the case might be, and outputs come out. And you have to be able to translate them all to a common denominator, which is money, right? Even if you're able to do it at a high level, you're going to be like 10 times better off than trying to like shoot in the dark and figure out, oh, I think it's going to make sense. Oh, I think it's going to pay off. Not going to work, right? Not going to serve you very well in the long term. And once you understand that it's a system of inputs and outputs, then you need to start having a grasp of what are the levers that I can pull for what kinds of outcomes. The levers can be financial, they can be operational, they can be people, whatever the case might be. And likewise with the outputs, but you have to be able to translate it, because this ROI thinking of what you put in and what you get out is absolutely critical to being able to tell a good financial story. And then we already talked about, okay, therefore, if these are the levers and these are their effects, what are the things that I need to do for the least effort that'll get me the most impact? So the moment you start talking about your actions in those terms, you're going to start to be credible. And you're also going to start to be much more standing on a firmer footing as you move your startup forward. And what are the risks? Always keep talking about what can go wrong, how bad can it get, and what are we doing to mitigate those risks. The fact that you're a startup means you're high risk. Everybody understands that, right? But the question is it riskier than it has to be, right? So, and how are you mitigating those risks? So that's the second lens. And the third lens is always about the proof, right? Even if you're never going to get $1 from anyone else, for your own discipline and ensuring, Richard Feynman said that people are easy to fool, and the easiest person of all to fool is yourself, right? So especially when you're taken up by your vision, it's very easy to think, oh, this is going to work out, that's going to work out. So forcing yourself to get the proof, like what are your actual results, or how do others like you perform? Like what's the real world data that I can use to prove every leg of what I'm saying I'm going to do and why it makes sense, right? So it's always about bring the receipts, right? Make sure you're bringing the receipts. Or you live in Missouri, it's like the show me state. Like whatever you're saying, show me, right? Make sure that you can prove everything. So these are some of the things I want you to keep in mind as you're building your startup and kind of thinking about the elements of your financial story. So with that said, what exactly is your financial story and what you need to think about? So what we're going to do today is we're going to cover 5 pillars. So ensure that you have credible answers and that they all hang together, so that they're all at 5 feet or all at 15 feet and not one 5 foot here, one 10 feet there, and nothing hanging together in a cohesive form. So what are the 5 things? And these are, by the way, in order typically, right? Because if the first one doesn't work, there's no point kind of going to step 2 or step 3 or step 4. So first is all, and by the way, there is a slight bias in what I'm saying in terms of a high growth venture, but it is always geared to any kind of startup, any kind of new venture where you're going to consume resources from society and try to give something back that is of hopefully greater value, not equal, but at least greater value, and definitely not of lesser value. So first thing is, what market are you going to go after, right? How do you define your market? How big is it? And why is it attractive? And by the way, these are all how you define them, right? So there's no such thing that says the market is X. You can be solving the exact same problem and the market definition can be, 3 different things. So let's say you want to cure something to do with cancer, right? And let's even say, actually, let's make it even simpler. Let's say that you have a wearable device, some kind of a wearable health device. And let's say that it monitors your sleep. Okay, let's keep it super and simple. I'm a finance person, not a health person. So even if you think about a simple monitor that, a device that monitors your sleep, the market could be the athletic performance market. It could be the long-term cancer recovery market, or it could be the working mom who's just had a baby and cannot, manage her health or whatever the case might be. Those are 3 very different markets with the same exact device and mostly the same capabilities. But what's different about it is your perspective as a founder that comes and says, this is how I define the market and this is why it's attractive. So don't take that as a given and don't be passive about that market definition, and be able to define what that market is. And we'll go into each of these in a second. But I'm just saying that it's important for you to understand that you do have agency over that. You do have a strategic prerogative to say, I'm going to choose to define the market this way. And this is why. And remember, you bring in the numbers, you bring in the proof and say, this is why it makes sense, right? Without that market, there's really nothing else in terms of why this makes sense. Because if you're going to build something that two people can use, great, good for you, but it doesn't really impact anyone who has any significant resources to kind of, to share with you. The second is what's the product and what's the pricing, right? What exactly is the category, right? This, again, it could be software. You could solve the same problem. You could make it software. You could make it a device. You could make it a service. And you could make it, at least 3 or 4 different categories. So those have very significant downstream implications, not just for funding, but even for who your market is and how much, like what's the benchmark price that somebody will pay and so on and so forth. So make sure that you make that choice very thoughtfully and not just take it as a given and say, hey, if it's a sleep monitor, then it must be a health device. Maybe it is, but that's not a given. Who's going to pay and how will it make money? Like this is where I see most of the impact focused startups stumble because they assume that just because it's impact, they shouldn't have to be held to this discipline. You couldn't be more wrong, right? The more disciplined you are, first of all, it's going to open you up to other options that you may not have considered because you didn't look at it deeply enough. And those may open up other funding opportunities or even just a reduced need for funding in itself. So don't overlook this question of, how do you categorize your product? Who's going to pay for it? Why are they going to pay for it? And how is it going to make money, right? The third most critical thing is how are you going to get it to them, right? So the them could be both the buyer and the user. So you have to think about if the buyers and the users are different, you got to think about how you're going to find the users and how you're going to find the buyers, the people who are going to pay for it. Now, to me, whenever I work with a lot of founders, and the biggest differentiator between a entrepreneur and a real entrepreneur is their seriousness about the channel, because everybody's really infatuated with their product. They're infatuated with their problem. And then they assume that somehow the customers will find them, right? So build it and they will come. But if you go to a real world funder of any kind, this is where they're going to test it and see, can you really make this happen, right? You're telling me that this has the opportunity to impact, 200 million people. Where are you going to find them? How much is it going to cost to get this to them? How many of those 200 million people are going to actually take it up? How many of them are going to use it? How are you going to make this all happen, right? Both financially in terms of cost it takes, as well as operationally can you handle this stuff, right? So this is an absolutely critical aspect that many founders overlook and don't, you do so at your own peril. The fourth is, I call it profitability, but you can call it economic viability if you're a nonprofit. At the end of the day, you got to bring in more than you put out. I don't care if you're a nonprofit, if you're a for-profit, the amount of how much you need to do that varies. But if you're bringing in less than you're putting out, that's not a viable model, right? Ideally, you want, even if the bringing in is a grant, it doesn't matter, right? Let's say that you're serving a population that isn't paying for something and a foundation or someone else is paying for it. Those two still have to match. You cannot get less in grants than you're using to serve your, your target mission population. So how you're doing that, how sustainable it is, and how much of a safety cushion you have is an absolutely critical question that you have to answer. And the fifth is where kind of like your personal ambition and your personal vision comes in, which is what is your growth ambition, right? Like, do you want to become a $100 billion company? Do you want to become the next Uber? Are you okay being and there's nothing wrong with being a $100 million company or even a $10 million company. It's just a question of what you want and what makes sense for you. Right? It's hard, especially if you're living in Silicon Valley, it's hard to accept that anything less than a unicorn is even worth bothering about. But there are other things in life, right? So it's a question. My point is, you make a call in terms of what scale you want to reach and over what time frame, most importantly, because that growth rate and scale together will define pretty much what your options are in terms of funding, right? So those are the 5 pillars that you absolutely have to keep in mind. We'll jump into each of those, but at this point, let me pause and ask, are there any questions? I can't quite see the chat, so reach out, please. Keep me honest in case there are questions or comments in the chat that I'm missing. Any questions, comments so far? Awesome. Okay, cool. So let's jump into each of these. What I'm going to do is we're going to spend a few minutes on each of the pillars. And again, my job is not to tell you stuff, but my job is to ask you what questions to ask yourself so that you can give a credible and convincing answer to whoever you need to convince, mostly yourself, and then whoever you're trying to persuade to come work with you or give you stuff like money and resources and all that good stuff. We'll walk through all of the 5 pillars. I'll give you a framework in terms of how to work through this in a single page, a canvas that you can use as you build and refine your financial story. And then we'll end with some practical implications for what this means for you, for your, not for your go-to-market, but for your growth trajectory, and especially your funding choices. Okay, does that make sense in terms of a plan go forward? Awesome. Okay, so let's start at the market size. So this is the first question that you should ask yourself because it should be worth, it's very hard to start a business, whether it's a small business or a big business. Whether you're starting a restaurant for the local neighborhood or you're trying to build the next Uber, they're both very, very hard. So the point here is to figure out that whoever you're trying to serve is big enough to make it worth all of that pain and to justify all of that risk, right? Because those are the two big things that you're going to be facing every day as a startup builder. So questions I would ask are, what is the problem? Why is it urgent? Why is it significant? And what bad things are going to happen if you don't solve it? If bad things don't happen on a big enough scale, or if the consequences aren't painful enough for someone, then it's much harder to prove that somebody's going to do something different to do whatever you're asking them to do, right? First, prove to me that there is a problem that is very significant and that there is actually a true incidence, right? And this is a little bit more of a healthcare issue, meaning, I talk to founders all the time who want to cure cancer or some, rare disease. From a moral, ethical standpoint, does it have to be cured? Absolutely. But if you're going to go ask for money, and especially if you're going to ask for venture capital, for those of you who are doing that stuff, if only 10,000 people in the world every year get it, I'm glad only 10,000 people get it, but the market isn't big enough to justify a big investment, especially for the kind of money that's involved to bring that kind of solution to a place where they can use it, right? So what is the true incidence and who is the true accessible population for you is really critical. And what are the factors that are going to drive real adoption? In theory, it can feel like whatever you're developing is a no-brainer and people should develop it or adopt it because it's so obvious, yes. But you have to go out and prove it in the real world that they will actually do it. And usually they'll only do it because the pain is so great that they cannot, fathom not taking advantage of a solution like yours because their current situation is so painful. And then no matter what you're trying to do, please take at least an initial crack at understanding on a quantifiable basis what the market size is. This is not a big bubble that says my TAM is over 1 billion, my SAM is this, and my SOM is this. Please do not do that. That's a big dead red flag for anybody because it tells them that you don't really understand the market. What you really want to care about when you're talking about market size is how can you determine the unit size, the unit demand, right? How many of your widgets or whatever it is that you're delivering, how many of those can in theory be sold or used in the world? And what is the monetary value of each of those things? That's all you need. If you can prove to anyone that you have a solid basis, and they can be estimates, then you're on a good starting point. But okay, you can go validate them and look at something like a report, usually credible ones hopefully, that justify or validate what you come up with. But from the bottom up, if you're not able to say, hey, there are 380 million people in the United States, approximately, I don't know, 40% of them are between the ages of 30 and 55. I don't know if these numbers are right. And of those X% have this disease or whatever the case might be. And we think that of the percent who has the disease, only 10% take the effort to go get it diagnosed. And therefore, that's the real available market. It doesn't have to be perfect, but as a person who's giving you money or whatever the resources, I now know that you understand who these people are, which then sets you up for success in reaching them because now you're already starting to think about, okay, that means I can only reach the people who actually go to a doctor to get it diagnosed, for example, right? As an example. So which comes to the question of how much can you serve, which is a SAM, and how much of that can you realistically reach in what kind of time frame. So that is the true meaning of TAM, SAM, SOM, and make sure that you have some defensible basis for being able to give a number that makes sense to you, that you can explain in terms of the number of units and the dollars or the value per unit, right? Without that, there is no market. It's always going to be X number of people buying something for a Y price. And if you cannot tell your story in those terms, then your credibility is going to be impacted. So, we don't have to go into like a big thing about TAM, SAM, SOM, and all of that stuff. I do want you to remember a few key principles when you're market sizing it, right? When you talk about TAM, it represents everybody in the world in theory who could use whatever it is you're creating or selling, right? And give me a reasonable basis for that. When it comes to SAM, it only means practically how many of those can you reach. So for example, let's say that you're devising some cure for a disease and in theory, the whole world, anybody in the world who has that disease can use it, right? To cure themselves with the disease. So let's say there are 7 billion people in the world, and let's say you have found out that there are 2 billion people in the world who potentially have that disease. Okay, so your TAM, and let's say it costs, I don't know, $10 to treat it. So your TAM is 20 billion, right? I'm just making an example. But you cannot in theory reach all of them. Let's say that in practice, you can only reach those of them who are in Western countries. I'm making this up, right? So out of the 2 billion, let's say you can only come and reach, I don't know, 800 million of those. So that's your SAM, right? 800 million times 10, which is the value of your product. And of those, realistically, you can only reach those of them in the United States who actually have access to healthcare and have insurance, which then brings your number down to some X number, and then you test that to make sure that I can actually reach this number in some reasonable time frame. And reasonable is usually 5 to 7 years. 5 to 7 years, because it's hard to predict anything. Things change a lot. So you want to give something that whoever's giving you money can stand on, and also can see the dots connecting, right? I need to do this, and this, and I can see me going from where I am today to whatever this number is. So use that logic to build your TAM, SAM, SOM numbers, and it'll also put you on a strong footing to build your go-to-market strategy, to build your financials, and to build everything else like hiring plans and all the operational details that you have to have in place for this to work. Make sense so far? This is a really critical principle that I want to make sure everybody understands. So stop me if there are any questions. Excellent. So the question is, does it address real world issues? Is the adoption rate realistic? And is the revenue estimation credible? So it's always about stopping yourself and asking the questions like, wait a second, does this make sense? And at every step you want to be asking, wait a second, does this make sense? Can I explain it? Can I defend it? Once you're doing that, you're already 70, 80% of the way to having a good financial story, because it has those checks and balances, which is what I see most founders missing when they don't, use this kind of discipline in their thinking. Okay, let's go to the next one. It's product and pricing. So this is about, you've convinced yourself that you got this big opportunity, right? There are 2 billion people, you know what the market size is, it looks great, TAM, SAM, SOM, excellent. So you still have to tap that opportunity, and this is where you're bringing your perspective as a founder and saying, hey, for this opportunity, this is how I think I'm going to create the product. This is a category that I'm going to choose, and this is how I'm going to make money, right? So for example, the same wearable monitor, you could say the opportunity is the same. Let's say the opportunity is that, I don't know, athletes need to improve their performance, or people with some medical condition need to improve their treatment, or whatever the case might be, right? So that is the opportunity. But your path to tapping that opportunity might be to say, I'm going to sell this wearable monitor, and I'm going to sell it in this way, right? Who's going to pay for it? In my case, I'm going to choose that the doctor is going to pay for it. Or the patient is going to pay for it, or the clinic is going to pay for it, or whatever the case might be. Those are the strategic choices that you make about how you're designing this product. And they will have a very large impact on how attractive the opportunity itself is, and what the economic contours will be of that business when you finally bring it into being. And it's also going to determine how successful you're going to be, right? So let's say you choose a path that says, I'm going to get this reimbursed, and there's currently no code for this. I'm just making this up. It's going to get reimbursed, but there's no code for this. There's no proven pathways in the past, or anybody has paid for it. Medicaid and Medicare doesn't have a code, blah, blah, blah. So there's a much harder, line to get money, versus saying, hey, I'm going to price it in a way where I'm going to sell it in, I'm just making this up, physical therapy offices, right? Or something like that, where it's just sitting there. You have someone who's a very trusted influencer, who's the physical therapist, and he or she is going to be selling it. That's a different pathway and has different implications in terms of not just how you get funded, but whether you're actually going to succeed, and how much money and effort you're going to put for this to succeed. So make those choices thoughtfully, because they have big real world implications. And it's not just a story you're telling an investor or a grant writer. So first of all, what are all these paths, right? Both to the category, to the pathway to revenue. Which path did you pick and why? And what are the 1 or 2 critical things, the vital few things that are going to make or break your pathway to revenue, right? So for example, let's say that you decide you want a reimbursement pathway. So the 1 or 2 make or break pathways could be that unless you have a well-established reimbursement code, and you have proof that hospitals or clinics have been using that code for a long period of time, that's a make or break factor. If you don't have that, then you're not credible in saying, oh, I'm going to get it as a reimbursable expense. It's just not going to work, right? So that's why that skeptical mindset and that hard critical thinking is so important. And then who pays, and why will they pay, and what is value to them, right? So who pays might be the user, it might be a player of some kind, or it could be a complete third party like a foundation. So in any case, you have to be very clear what their value is. So in the case of the user, it's very simple. You improve my sleep, I'll pay for it, right? In the case of payer, it might be a little bit more complicated, but still somewhat tied to the user outcomes, and saying, well, if it falls in these codes, or if it falls within our rules, we'll pay you, but we'll only pay you X amount, right? We're not going to pay you. If you're asking for $100, we might pay you 35, right? For example. But if you're going to someone completely different, for example, if it's a foundation or someone, you have to be very careful about what does value mean to them. Are these impact metrics? Are they measurable? Are they not measurable? So it's important for you to think from day one, before you go down the path of saying, we're going to do the following 3 things, to understand that you have a leg to stand on those things. And also, in light of those, how much are you charging, on what basis, and why, right? So you have to be able to defend it and say, so monetization and how you build revenue is actually a pretty important path. We've talked about reimbursement. I think I've said enough. And most important thing here is you have to have some proof that what you're saying is the path to revenue is actually going to work, right? Either you've sold it yourself and you've demonstrated that you have a pilot client, whatever the case might be, or you have something that's very close, very comparable, and that's almost the same thing, where there's an established track record. If people have been buying Fitbits for years and years, then it's not hard to convince people that they might buy another device, especially when it has some significant benefit to a very specific portion of the population, right? So that's one of the things you need to keep in mind, and those are the questions you need to be able to defensively answer once you think about the product. Are we okay so far? Is it making sense? Any questions, concerns, comments? Awesome. Richard, let me know if there's any comments I'm missing on the chat. Thank you. Then let's come to channels, right? So you have the opportunity, you've identified a way that you're going to make money. How are you going to get it to your customers? So the question here is, what is the thing that's going to flip a switch where somebody's going to wake up and say, I need to buy this thing, right? And then when they say, I need to buy this thing, where are they going to go find it? That's a question you have to answer in very simple terms, right? This is not your field, but let's say that you're selling enterprise software. Nobody wakes up in the morning saying, gee, I want to get up today and buy enterprise software, right? It's just not what you do. However, there might be an accountant who's really upset and frustrated that there's a problem in not being able to verify their supplier bills. Or in the case of healthcare, there might be, it's not that they buy the specific thing that you're doing, but they want that pain to go away and they want it to go away now. And they will do anything now to make it happen. It's the headache. It's a classic headache versus vitamin pill. It's nice to take vitamins, but this is really a headache that I really cannot think about anything else unless I get rid of this migraine. The closer you get to that level, the better off you are in terms of making sure that you have a customer at the end of the channel. And then the question is going to be, how are you going to get it to them, right? The high level question that you have to answer is, what kinds of channels are you talking about? You don't need to have the specifics, but are we talking like a mass market, mass distribution, sell it on Walmart or Amazon kind of distribution? Are we talking about, I'm going to partner with medical distributors and sell it? Are we talking about, we need to integrate with Epic or some other electronic medical records provider, otherwise we cannot get to that end customer who's sitting there, right? You need to be really clear of what does that look like, and therefore what are the requirements that you have to meet for this channel to work, right? If you're going to go with Epic or whoever the case might be, are you competing with something else? Do you know what Epic looks for in the people that they will allow through their pipe? And what does that financially mean for you? What does it operationally mean for you? What does it mean in terms of, whether you're able to protect your, your core assets or not? Think through these carefully before you go too far down the path, because they can force you to go down very different paths. And in fact, if you find that the channel doesn't work, you might actually come back and revisit both your product and your market. And that's okay, because you're a startup. You're not supposed to have all your answers right. But it gives you a disciplined method through which to go back, as opposed to just randomly shooting in the dark and saying, oh, I think I'm going to do this. I'm going to go do that. It's just a waste of time and money, and time is extremely limited, and it's your most significant resource. So, okay, once you figured out that I've got my channel, I'm going to do electronic and medical records, what is the process that needs to happen, right? So, for example, if you're reliant on a very powerful channel partner, for example, Epic, or for example, a very powerful distributor, there are certain things that you need to do to fit in their box, right? So that's one part of the purchase process. And then for the end buyer, let's say a hospital is buying something, they may have their own vendor requirements and this and that and the other thing. So especially if you're selling into businesses and large organizations, it's really critical for you to understand. So don't go too far down the path, because you might have to design it in a way that fits those. Otherwise, it's a basically dead on arrival kind of product, right? Because it's not going to land where you need it to land for it to work, right? So don't underestimate that. And what is it going to cost, right? You don't need to know down to the fourth decimal point, but you need to know, is it $10 to reach a customer or $1,000? And what does that mean in terms of your product, your margin, and how much you'll have to spend to get each of these guys, in the door? And of course, what's the last question? What is the proof, right? Prove every one of these things, not, to the level of scientific rigor, randomized control experiment, but you have to be a credible source of proof to say, this is why I think it's going to work. And here's a real world example. So the real world data that shows you that this is going to work. Next is profitability, right? Very simple. How much are you bringing in per unit? How much does it cost to get it out? That gives you the safety cushion with which you can play and do all the other stuff that you need to do that's not dependent on product. That's basically it, right? So That means that you understand what is the basis on which you get money. So for example, I'll give you an example from cleantech. It's easy to understand. I was working with a founder who was helping, let's say, universities, okay, manage their recyclable waste. And what she wanted to do was she wanted to charge on a per university basis. It made no sense to me whatsoever. There are only a finite number of universities in the world, and no matter how much they use or how little they use, she has capped her revenue, right? So this is not a trivial question. It goes back to the question of, are you thinking thoughtfully about how you're charging revenue? What is the basis on which you get it? And therefore, are your costs aligned with how you're charging money? In her case, if she were going to charge it by a university, for example, regardless of how many locations there were and how much trash was there, her costs were going to vary based on the volume, but our price is capped at the university level. That makes no sense, right? So those are the kinds of things that you want to make sure that, first of all, that you have a lot of headroom for your revenue to grow in the way, and of course, it has to work with the customers and how they think about paying for these things. But you have to optimize within those constraints to make sure that you're giving yourself a lot of headroom. And most importantly, that as your costs go up, your revenue also goes up, because otherwise you're going to be out of business pretty quick, right? So those are kinds of strategic choices that you have to make, not about the financial model and how much does it cost. And is there a trajectory to the cost, right? If you're making hard stuff, or even if you're not making hard stuff, right? How does your cost scale as your volume scales? And are there any pitfalls that you want to think about in advance? Not a big deal, but you need to be having these questions to say, is this something I should worry about? Or is it something I should not worry about? And if I do need to worry about it, at what point do I need to start thinking about it? So that you kind of put it in a parking lot and say, I don't need to worry about it now, but 6 months or 12 months, 15 months from now, or my volume hits 1 million units, I need to come back and look at this, because that's when this is going to become a pressing issue. How much does it run? How much does it cost to just run the ship? How much does it charge? How much does it cost to keep the lights on, as they say? Rough idea, keep it lean, not much more needed to say. And then at what point roughly will you think you break even, right? So these are the critical questions. You don't need minute answers to them, but you need a strategic answer to them. First, you have to have the strategy and a basis for the strategy, and then the model and the financial, projections will all work themselves out. But if you don't have a strategic rationale for why that is, it's a waste of time to do anything on the models or any of the tactical stuff. So get the strategy right. And like I said, what are there, like in terms of volume, are there strategic inflection points, right? So at what points do you become a fundamentally different business, which requires a different investment in, I don't know, HIPAA compliance, whatever the case might be. So think about those things and say, set yourself up with like markers and red flags and green flags, so that as a CEO, you're making the right choices and you always have a view to the next 5-10 miles, as opposed to just reacting today to whatever's coming up. And that that's not a way to either do anything or win anybody's confidence. The last one is about growth. This is the question here is, what are the milestones, right? So you're here today, and then you're going to have some golden vision in the future when the world is beautiful and your product is out with everybody who wants it, will pay for it. There are a lot of things you need to break that down into specific, manageable bite-sized pieces, which we call milestones. Now, the key to milestones is two things. The first is that you actually have to have milestones, and you have to have them in a way that you can tell yes or no, did I meet it or not? It's a pass-fail criterion. I will sign up, 10 pilot clients, whatever. It's not I'll sign up some pilot clients. I cannot say if you did it or not, because some could be 2, some could be 25, right? I will sign up 5 enterprise clients by end of the year, right? Blah, blah, blah. So it needs to be very objective. But more importantly, the question is, you want to be sequencing them in a way that the most risky milestones are first, right? Because it's the most load-bearing pillar of your structure that needs to be tested first. So typically, if you think about startups, there are either product risk startups or market risk startups, meaning that the danger is in either that you can actually build a product, or the danger is that people will buy it. Those are broadly the two types of risks that there are in startups. And your milestones, the way you set them, should reflect that. So let me give you an example of a product risk startup, right? Let's say you come in and say, I found a cure for cancer, where all you need to do is you take one pill and it destroys every kind of cancer there is, and the remission rate is 0.00004%. Is that a product risk or a market risk? Anybody want to guess? Is the danger that you cannot build a product, or is the danger that people will not buy a product where you can prove that you take one pill and in 99.9999996% of the cases, it will go away and never come back? Which is the bigger risk? Anyone? Which do you find
I
harder to
think I
believe?
would product risk.
100%. You're exactly right. So things that are like very technically challenging are product risk companies. So in those cases, you want to stagger the product milestones first, because the real question is not people will buy. The real question is, can you build this product? But in most cases where it's not very deep innovation, right? Like you're inventing a new material, you're curing cancer, in much larger percentage of cases, the risk is really, will the dog eat the dog food? Will the market buy? Right? So in those cases, what you want to do is you want to get a good enough product that somebody can say, yeah, I see what it does. I know it doesn't have all the bells and whistles, but I can kind of see it, but I'm going to buy it. So you just want to get it to enough of a product and then immediately go and set up some market milestones and say, how can I prove with real world evidence that people are going to buy this, right? That is absolutely key. So those are two things I want you to remember about milestones. So make sure that you're understanding how to sequence them, with the highest risk ones coming first, and setting reasonable milestones that are consistent to the resources you have in hand, right? If you want to build a factory, you need $100 million, but you can build something at lab scale for maybe $500,000, right? So setting those milestones in the right order at the right magnitude is absolutely critical, because it'll ensure that you're spending money where you need to be spending and your time where you need to be spending. So which brings us to, how much money do you need? What resources do you need? And why does this make sense? And most importantly, what is my end game financially, right? Do I want to build a $10 million company? Do I want to build a startup, or $100 million? It doesn't matter if you're for profit or not for profit, but scale does matter, right? You can have a $100 million nonprofit too. But how quickly you grow and how big you grow are two very, very, very big determinants of what it means for you to get funding, how you'll stack the efforts that you need, how you'll sequence them, and all of that stuff. And it's good, you can change it later, but it's good for you to have a high level idea to say, hey, I'm shooting for this kind of end game in this kind of time frame, right? And then you work back and say, what that means for me is, it means this kind of revenue, that means this kind of investment, which means this kind of funding, which we'll talk about in a second. So does that make sense in terms of 5 pillars? And do you guys feel like you have a good idea? Any questions, concerns, comments, thoughts? Awesome. I've covered a lot, but I think hopefully you've gotten the basics, and it's fairly simple. So it's just a matter of iteration, right? Continue to practice asking the questions and answering. Initially, it'll be uncomfortable. Then over time, you'll get really good at it. So that's it. How do you make this happen? So we put together a handy dandy little framework that I call the Acquire framework, right? So to put together your financial story, just follow these simple steps to just kind of practice and get the mental kind of muscle memory to do this. So first you articulate on any given pillar, any of these 5 pillars. And by the way, you can also go down into micro pillars, right? So if you're talking about product, you can talk about revenue model. You can apply it at any level, up or down as you like. First, whatever the question is, like, what's my channel strategy? Articulate what your strategy is. Just, you need to say it in simple English and say, this is what we're going to do, right? I'll give you an example in a second. Next, quantify important assumptions, right? How will you translate whatever you just said into things that are very quantifiable, measurable, objective? And then you go out, test it in the real world, and then you need to iterate and prove, is this really going to work, right? You may not prove it at the scale that you want it to, but at some scale that's relatable and kind of extrapolatable to that scale, you want to be able to prove things as much as possible with the resources that you have on hand. How does it relate to what you're talking about in terms of your big vision as you get into more advanced, model projections? Are those two talking to each other? And then how do you elevate it in terms of things that people who give you big things, care about, like usually money. And we'll talk about that in a second. So let's say that you're building a medical device. I come back to my favorite example. How would you, and let's say you're building out the channel strategy. How would you work this? So you want to first articulate, what is my channel strategy for this medical device? So the question here is, can you distill your idea in one sentence? That's factual, provable, easy to understand. So let's say I say that I'm going to sell my product through hospital distributors. Okay, next I want to quantify. Can you put a number that's testable? So I say that, okay, my product is going to be sold through hospital distributors. And I know that the top 3 distributors in this country, whichever country it is I want to sell in, they cover 1,600 hospitals. And I expect to sell $24,000 of my magical widget to each hospital through these distributors. Okay, I check the box on quantify. Next, I want to go out and test it and iterate it. Have you tried it in the real world? Maybe you cannot sell it to all 3 distributors, but can you sell it to one hospital through one distributor and give me a number that works, right? So then you say, okay, let's run a pilot. I'm only going to work with one distributor because they're small, they're struggling, and they're eager to try new things. I'm going to sell 5 hospitals, right? So you do a pilot, and then you figure out that the average contract value, you're actually able to convert 5 hospitals who agreed to do your pilot with this device. And the average contract value is actually 29,000 versus what you thought was going to be 24,000, which is awesome, right? Then, okay, now what does this mean for the bigger vision? You come back and relate to it. So you come back and say, now that I know this, what I'm going to say is that for me to scale this thing, I think the best way to do it is through salespeople, because I can have one salesperson covering each distributor. And then I need 3 salespeople. They're going to take, 6 months to ramp up. And then they're going to, sell XYZ. Now, when you go present that to an investor or anybody else, it's a very credible story because you have facts to back up every bit of what you've just said instead of, oh, I think I'm going to go sell it through distributors. Last but not least, you have to elevate it always to the financial terms, which is what it boils down to at the highest level, regardless of what you're doing, right? It always comes down to the financials, whether you like it or not. So the question, I want you to remember 3 R's. It is this, so what? So you told me all these things. You told me your channel strategy. So why should I care, right? Usually I care in terms of 3 things. Does it matter to revenue? Does it matter to risk? And does it matter to returns? So now that you told me that you're going to use these 3, 3 salespeople to cover these top 3 distributors, what it matters to me is this is why I'm able to grow sales at 25% a month for the first 2 years, because see, I've showed you exactly how that works. So now I can see a result that I can get excited about. In this case, it's about revenue. You've also, it could also be about risk. For example, if you make an investment in, I don't know, some compliance software, you could say what this does is it brings down the risk of fines from 20% to 10% or whatever the case might be, right? But it always comes down to revenue, to the risk, or to the returns. Like always translate the so what and say, so as you go through this discipline process, in the beginning, your guesses will be wildly off and you'll feel very uncomfortable and unhappy and miserable. And then very quickly you will get better. And over time, you'll develop that fluency and then it'll become second nature. And then that part is like, that moment is a very exciting moment. I can tell you from seeing other founders and from personal experience. Does this framework make sense? Any questions?
Yes,
And I'll share this this canvas with you guys. It's like simple PDF. There's no AI magical stuff. You need to be able to think and answer a question that makes sense to a very skeptical, any kind of business person from whom you need something, right? It could be a hospital you're trying to sell to. It could be whatever the case might be. So keep this handy so that everything should hang together and you should be able to speak in a real world setting and say, this is what I'm trying to do. This is why I'm trying to do it. And this is why it makes sense, right? So with that said, I want to spend like a couple of minutes on getting funding, right? Especially if you're anywhere near Silicon Valley, the first thing, or if you're an accelerator, everybody's like, okay, we do this, we do a pitch deck, and then there's a demo day, and we're going to go pitch to investors. And then we're going to go talk to VCs. So I'm going to say, hold it just a second. Before that, let's talk about what you want to do from your startup, right? And the biggest question that you'll have to address is what is the growth scale that you want to be achieving? And let's think about 3 different types of companies. Let's say there's a 1x growth company, a 10x growth company, and a 100x growth company. So let's say the 3 companies that are starting line, all of them are starting through $250,000 in sales, but they have very different trajectories and a very different growth path. The first one, let's say, is a bakery, right? It's growing at, there's nothing wrong with bakeries, by the way. I love muffins and cakes, especially. But their annual growth rate is 10%. Nothing to be ashamed of with the 10% growth rate. What happens is after 5 years, they're now at $400,000 in sales, and their monthly sales growth is 0.8%. This is the kind of company that should never be going anywhere near an investor, right? Because there is no growth, there is no upside, so there's no reason for me to give you equity capital, and I'll be, this kind of company should be going and getting some other traditional sources of money, right? Crowdfunding, bank loans, whatever the case might be. But let's say you're a 10x company, which is actually to me is a very sweet spot. Is the same company, let's say they're building a software platform for, I don't know, hospital logistics, okay? They're growing at 50% a year, which is pretty impressive. And in 5 years, they're at 8 million in sales. And at a monthly, they're growing at 3.5%. That's a growth story, right? But it's still not a VC story. It's only a growth story. So now, because there's so much growth, there's also more risk. And because there's so much growth, you also need more money. So this is where you start moving away from the traditional sources of bank loans and all of that stuff and start thinking about people who are more comfortable with the risk, typically be like angels or maybe crowdfunding, where they understand you're trying to reach for the sky, you're trying to do something risky, but they want to be part of it and they understand that there's a significant chance that they could lose money, right? But this is not where VCs play, by the way. Only in the case where you're a 100x company, let's say it's the same company that's starting with $250,000 in sales, and they're growing, but they're doubling every year. And in 5 years, they're a $100 million company. And every month, they're growing at 10%, right? This is the true VC territory, right? These are companies where VCs are interested. And if you're not able to prove that you're in this kind of a market and you're able to justify this kind of growth, I tell you, please don't waste your time with VCs. It's just a huge waste of time. It's not worth it. And they're not going to, give you anything for this. The rule of thumb for them generally is 33322 is like you have to be able to triple sales for the first 3 years and then double. That's roughly where you get to be a roughly $100 million company in 5 years. But now even that is too low. If you really want to be VC fundable, you should really be shooting for 300 million in revenue in 5 or 7 years, which I don't know how many companies realistically do that, but go in with your eyes wide open. So depending on where you are in your process, you could be at the idea stage, you could be at proof of concept or prototype stage, early sales, growth, scaling, maturity. And depending on whether, I'm not even going to talk about 1x, I assume you guys are all at least 10x or 100x type companies. So depending on whether you're a 10x or 100x company, there are different sources that make sense. The big message here is don't even think about VC until you're revenue positive or have something really significant like you're Mira Murati and you just came out of OpenAI or whatever the case might be. Okay, maybe then you'll get the money, but for us normal mortals, it's very tough to get that kind of money, right? So early on, focus on non-dilutive funding, bootstrapping. If you have to sell services, so be it, grants, all of that stuff, and friends, family. Only when you have proven something and have some real numbers and evidence to show, should you even start thinking about, maybe crowdfunding or angels. Some angels, not all, right? Depends, that field is really varied. And even if there's niche VCs that you want to go after or specialize in your area, typically they won't look at you until you're in the growth and scaling stage. And that is getting later and later, right? There's this little gap in the middle between early sales and then growth and scaling, or even proof of concept and revenue. So be very thoughtful and try to rely on non-dilutive funding as much as possible so that you're not beholden to a new boss who then now runs how your life should be done. If you're a for-profit and want to get VC funding, think very, very hard about that, right? So regardless of where you are, different things become important, right? When you're in the product stage, the real question is, are you focusing on the right markets? Are you fishing in the right pond? As you get into, the business model and now you have a product and people buy it, then start focusing on how are you going to make money. That becomes the real focus, where you need to prove it and test it and show the evidence. And likewise, as you go further and further, the different pillars kind of start to come into focus and become more important. You do need to have a hypothesis on all of those from day one, but they get sharper and tested more rigorously as you progress along the path. So make sure that you're checking the boxes as you go along, but you should be thinking about all of these, from day one. So what I'll leave you with is this, many of you are scientists, I think all of you are scientists, so you bring that scientific thinking to bear. Regardless of what you're doing, you're testing something at every step, right? Whatever it is you're doing, whether it's a new version of the product, hiring a salesperson, whatever the case might be, what is the goal of this? Why are you doing it? How is it going to impact your end goal? What's the path to get there? And whatever choice you made, you chose one versus the other. Let's say you chose a distribution, dealer distribution versus something else. Why will it work? What is the reason why this is a better bet and a less risky bet for you than some other options that you could have considered? And is it the best answer that you can think of now? It's still a hypothesis, right? But make sure that it's the best reasoned hypothesis that you can come up with. And then give me have a picture of what do you think the result will look like. Let's say that you hire a salesperson, or you test some proof of concept with 4 pilots. What do you want that good result to be? And what needs to happen and what needs to be in place and what you need to believe for that to happen? So that you're preparing for those wins at every step of the way, and always quantify, right? How much will it cost? How long will it take? What quantifiable outcomes will it produce? The more you focus and force on quantifiable outcomes, regardless if it's financial or not, the better you'll be disciplined and the more value you can extract, and learning from every step you take. You should not take any step if it's not giving you valuable learnings in new information that you couldn't have had otherwise. And what if we're not right? What if this doesn't play out? Always have that plan B, plan C, plan D thinking at the back. It doesn't have to be big, but it's just this holistic way of thinking that will allow you to function as an effective CEO and founder. And the bottom line is, for every hour you invest and for every dollar you put in, I want to make sure that you get the most bang for your buck. And that bang for your buck could either be actual traction, which is ideal, right? You go out and build the thing that you want to build, but at a minimum, that the bang for the buck could be the learning, the information to say, okay, now I know for sure that I'm not going to look at dealers because of the following 3 reasons. And I didn't have to spend 1 year of my life and $100,000 to find out. I just did this little experiment and I could immediately tell that this is not going to work. Focus on those kinds of experiments. So I'll leave you with one thing, which is, remember, everybody lives in Missouri in startup land. It's about show, don't tell. Don't tell me I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, or don't even tell yourself. Prove it. So with that, I know we have 4 minutes. I'll hang around for a little longer. If you have questions, I have some resources here that are free and complimentary. I have a podcast that is completely focused on financial storytelling for STEM. So a lot of healthcare is there. I think I shared a curated list as well earlier that you may have seen. There's a newsletter where I also focus on financial storytelling. This is up to you. There's absolutely no compulsion to do any of this stuff, but I just want to offer it up for what it's worth to all of you guys. So with that, I will stop sharing. And we covered a lot, but hopefully it just gave you a method of thinking about things versus just, stuffing content into your head, which is not my intent. And I'll see if there are any questions, comments, concerns. Wow, I either blew you away or you're all asleep. I don't know which one it is.
No, it was actually pretty clear. So I do not have questions. And the things what you discussed is like it's non-negotiable, it's not debatable, it's very clear, it's very strict. It's a rule, it's not like an exception here for interpretation. So I absolutely have no questions. And I myself come from a financial background. So, I absolutely have nothing to say but agree.
Perfect.
So
Thank you
yeah.
for that. Thanks. Appreciate it. Any other questions, comments? And Richa, I will share the canvas and the resource page for you to share with everyone else, hopefully today or tomorrow. But if there are any questions, you guys, please, I can put my email in the chat. Feel free to email. I'm a bit bandwidth constrained, but I'm very inspired by what you guys are trying to do. So I'll do my best to get back. I think you're the guys who are going to change the world. So I'm rooting for all of your success.
Thank you so much for joining. That was super helpful. I see that you posted your email in the chat. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out. And then I will get the slides and also share it with everyone. So thank you so much. Reminder, one pager is due this Friday. So looking forward to reading all of those. Otherwise, good luck on building and we will talk soon.
All the best, guys.